Dr. Buck Weaver. I'm a neuropsychologist and director of the Weaver Center here in Wayland, Massachusetts. It's very nice to be getting all the feedback that you've all given me, so thank you. And please keep those emails and questions coming to rweaver@weavercenter.org. And I'm happy to get the list that's growing and growing. Today, one of the things that people have made so many comments about is about adults with ADHD or adults with EFD, executive function or organizational difficulties. As I've mentioned in the past, the difference between attention deficit and executive function difficulties is that attention deficit have symptoms that are in the moment. One's easily distracted, or they're impulsive, or their mind is wandering, or it's very hard to pay attention. With boredom on both executive function and attention, learning really slows down, even when talking with someone. So these difficulties that are attentionally oriented are things that happen in the moment that need further awareness in terms of the work that we do with people. Executive function or organizational difficulties are those things that occur over time. Planning, organizing, starting, completing, refining, time management, things that those of us, myself included, that have serious difficulties with those are less efficient. You know, those people that are efficient, they get a lot of stuff done, they're detail-oriented, they make lists, they get, just a kind of a natural talent for being productive. We struggle with what's a priority, how do you get started, when do you get started, how do you know how you're doing? We all think that we know just as much about this as everybody else, but the fact is, we don't. So one of the things that we do so much of the time in working with adults and couples and others is the first and most important part is raising awareness, which is what anybody would say, well, of course, that's what you do. Do you know what I mean? And the way that we do that is to educate folks so that, like we mentioned before, we know the difficulties with getting started because we don't feel the consequences that are coming our way, like most everybody does. Those people that feel consequences, they know that they're going to be nervous or upset or embarrassed or whatever. We don't have that chip. So it's much harder for us to get started. And that's why we often have a lot of people conflicting with us to try to get us to start because they feel the consequences even when we don't. So a lot of things that we say, I got plenty of time, or I'll just do one more, or, this isn't that important, or I got plenty of, we have ADHD monster statements that interfere with us all the time. And so we do a lot of specific things to be helping people. But I wanted to, I've been working with a 51-year-old fellow, and he's very interesting. And I think that even though we're doing a lot of things that are appropriate for older adults, a lot of these things are very similar, maybe a little less sophisticated, but with younger people, especially adolescents. And this fellow, and I work on Skype quite a bit, so I Skype nationally and internationally. And sometimes people that I like to work with or like to work with people here might be down the street, but they prefer to do their counseling and educational work in their room rather than come into the office. But this fellow came in, and he was pretty depressed and pretty anxious and uncomfortable. And to another clinician, that certainly would be a big red flag. To what degree is there problems with attention or organization or productivity, and to what degree are these emotional difficulties, which are very real, are related to the organization problems, or they have their own origins, either genetically or in terms of life circumstances. So we're always doing differential views of different possibilities. And a lot of times it's not just one. But in this case, when I talked with him about, so what's your discouragement about? He had a litany about how his wife, who actually is a special education teacher, and his two daughters, just have such a difficult time with him, and always have. They joke about him being the third kid in the family, and Dad, and most of the things are like just never, ever, ever getting to places on time, being ready, and so on and so forth. And of course, the reason this is so bothersome to other people is because if they were behaving like he is, they would have to do it on purpose. They couldn't see it any other way. So, of course, this is interpreted as, listen, you're capable of moving. Come on, just do it, right? Because the idea of not knowing what this is about, all you come up with is laziness or not caring or taking it personally. Or there's a lot of things that make a great deal of sense about how other people are frustrated around us. And there's much better explanations for that, but most importantly, there's much better things to do about it. Almost everybody says, what's going to happen if you're late. How it's going to upset people. And of course, we know what the consequences are, but we don't feel them. So we just think that, hey, we got plenty of time. What are you barking about? Right? But as I said, it's translation from someone that can feel the consequences to us about, yelling and screaming and carrying on to move. All right? So what we've been working on, because he has a very difficult time getting to work on time, it's created a lot of problems with his peers. Certainly in terms of getting to any activity with anybody in his family, even though he has adult children, is almost a lost cause, and comes across often as, let's not include Dad because we'll be waiting all day. So the first thing that we tackle, because it was his first thing to tackle, was being on time to work. And we take almost any issue that you want to start with, because we always use strengths, right, to be able to design specific compensatory strategies that are effective. So we began talking about what his morning was like and what kinds of things might make him late. And he mentioned a lot of the things that we know that people mention that we attribute to the attention monster, or we have other ways of doing therapy, but it gives you a kind of a sense that we look at these things as something that interferes with you getting to doing what you want, not you're doing it. And again, all of those things, got plenty of time, I'm stuck, I just finished this will be one more time, and so on and so forth. So we said, starting to use technology is very important to set alarms for things that help you move. Now we have phones that can do that. And so over the course of 3 weeks, right, we've been fine-tuning. He sets 5 alarms for each morning. And he can snooze, but he can't turn it off until he can't push stop until he's on his way. So getting up, doing the bathroom and getting dressed portions, getting things prepared for work, getting to the door and out the door. Each time there's an alarm, he practices, and we practice together, disengagement. Whatever you're doing, you've got to disengage to get on to the next. Got to. Hardest thing you got to do. It's very, very difficult. And it takes a lot of practice and a lot of effort, because we're not being motivated by the consequences. Again, most of us know that if we're not in time, we're going to be in trouble. We don't have that chip, right? So that's what moves everybody else through the day, being conscious of what and when they got to do everything. So he has been using for the last 3 weeks, and we've been fine-tuning, so that he can get out of the house at the time that he needs to get to places on time. This week, when we were, and in the past, it was hard for him to get to Skype on time. This week he was early to Skype. He said it was really great. He had a cup of coffee. He was much more relaxed. Because he likes to Skype from work. He gets to work on time. And it's really been an amazing and very uplifting sense of control over something that was really out of control for so long. Anyway, by having strategic things based on his strengths, because he's auditory, he can write all the notes or have calendars in his, anything visual, not going to help him. But when you start working with people to develop strategies, it works very, very well. And they become more and more confident, more and more in control. Other people notice, especially the hardest things that you've ever been doing. If you make big changes in those, people really notice that. So anyway, thanks so much for listening. I hope it's helpful. Please don't hesitate to write any other ideas at my email, rweaver, W-E-A-V-E-R, at weavercenter.org. I just want to remind you that I'm a rocker, right? That's part of my ADHD. I'm always moving, so I hope you're not seasick by watching these videos. But thanks so much for your attention. I appreciate it greatly. And several people have written me emails, which is really nice to be getting questions, and have said, well, I know that you've kind of mentioned that you've had attention deficit and executive function, and what's your story? So here's a little rundown of my story for those of you who might be interested. I was very fortunate in the sense that I was diagnosed when I was in, I think, first grade, because I had an older sibling that was diagnosed in fourth grade with having dyslexia. And in those days that they knew that learning disabilities and attention deficits and so forth were largely genetically determined. And as it turned out, my dad had some difficulties, and other people in the family history. So genetics is the largest, not the only, way to have learning problems. And so I was diagnosed at Boston Children's Hospital, or I think Mass General Hospital, that was at that time doing a great deal of work on dyslexia and the treatment of, and Orton Gillingham practices to help kids learn how to read and write and spell. But I certainly remember before I was diagnosed, my first school experience was at a local nursery school. And I have a feeling my mom was probably pretty excited about having me be in school for a little bit, because I was very hyperactive. I was always up in trees and on lakes, and she was always worried about the ice being too thin and where I was, and I was a bit of a management problem in those days. What I would eat, what I wouldn't eat, what I'd pay attention to, what I wouldn't pay attention to, how best to move from one place to another, small things like that. My poor mom. Anyway, so I went to this nursery school, and apparently after a couple, 2-3 days, or maybe a week or two, my mother and father got a phone call and said, we'd like to talk with you about Bucky. That was my name back then. And apparently, or reportedly, I've heard this later, I don't remember it per se, but the teacher and the principal of the school said that your son has a little bit too much trouble with crayons, scissors, materials. Apparently, I wasn't being restricted to the places where they should be used, and I used them pretty inappropriately, and I was pretty hard to catch. And I did run away a lot of times, and apparently they thought it would be better if Bucky was at home, which I'm sure that pleased my parents a great deal. But that apparently was my first school experience. I think it lasted a couple, 2-3 weeks, who knows. But anyway, after I was diagnosed because of my older sister, my first diagnosis was dyslexia, which I didn't know what that meant. As far as I was concerned, it was like a disease. It didn't seem like a common name to me. And later on in the history, it was minimal brain damage, because they started to include hyperactivity and inattention and organization and self-esteem issues, all of which I had in great measure. I think reading retardation was in that program. So, my experiences in school were really, really hard. I was very fortunate in that my folks could provide, daily Orton-Gillingham, which was being researched at that time and is now used at most of the main schools for children with dyslexia or language-based learning disabilities. And I did that every day. My mother either drove me or I rode my bike, or every single day from first grade on through most of high school. Very fortunate to be able to get that kind of help. My parents did everything they could to learn about it, even though the intelligent conclusion for me was that I was dumb as a post. I mean, who doesn't know how to learn the letters or learn the alphabet or know what they sound like? And I can remember very specifically drawing the letters and saying the letters and the first word that came with those letters, and then I would go back to a letter that I just learned and had no idea what it was. So I felt pretty stupid. I think that was a pretty large cornerstone of my first feeling of self-confidence and self-esteem. And throughout school, I had real trouble with reading. In those days we read out loud, line by line. I would never know where I was. The teacher would come over, being very nice, and say, well, Bucky, why don't you just start right here? And it didn't make any difference. I didn't know what the word said. And, the same with math. I could never get my math tables done. I think that was fourth grade. In those days, they had, teachers that were being trained, and so all of the kids that had some trouble with learning their math facts sat in the back of the classroom. And one by one, when they got their math facts, they'd regain back into the classroom. And I was fortunate enough to be there all year long. I never got my math facts. Still don't have my math facts, thankfully. You know what I mean? Digital. It's a good thing. And so I was really feeling bad. I acted out. I'd much rather be in the principal's office than in the classroom. Being sick, almost anything that I could do to get out of the classroom. And, by junior high school, it was just miserable. I couldn't do what any of the other kids were doing. I was acting out a lot. I was getting F's on all my papers, doing no homework, not caring, not being invested. Why bother? The more I was invested, the more it felt bad when I did poorly. Low effort failure is a lot easier to take than high effort failure. So I learned that pretty quick. But my parents said a very important thing, and I'm going to try to riddle my conversation throughout these earlier times. My parents said a very important thing. They said in middle school, where at the time I think I was having a competition with another fellow on who could get the most attentions, which I'm a pretty competitive guy. But because I always told the truth, I didn't get expelled when the other fellow did. So that was one thing that my parents really put on me. They said, listen, just tell the truth. Get in trouble, you get in trouble. The truth isn't so bad. And, I'd much rather hear the truth, so I've always been a truth teller. But the other thing that they said, and this is what I was getting onto, they said, we no longer are going to emphasize grades. In those days, they had attitude marks, 1 through 4, 4 being terrible. So I had F's and all 4s. But they said anybody can have a good attitude, and anybody can pay attention to the teacher, and anybody can offer to clear the board or wash the board or put things away or advocate for yourself. Just ask for what you need. If you need some time out, and join the teachers with an understanding of the frustrations and anger that you have. And that was really important for me, because I learned that better relationships are as good as doing well in school, if that's the best you can do. And also my parents knew that if I was doing the best I could in terms of attitude and trying and so on and so forth, I clearly was doing the best I could do, even though it might be terrible. So teachers began to give me, more support, more appreciation, instead of being a bad guy that required the toughest old birds of teachers, which I did have a few. So that was a pretty big turning point. I also had some trouble with acting out in the community and, with my parents. And, I was an angry, depressed young lad that couldn't do what everybody else seemed to be doing so easily. So then I also didn't have any friends during that time. I had, by the end of middle school, maybe one friend who also wasn't doing very well. Very quiet guy, but, it was nice to have a friend. And then through high school, I started to do sports. I started to have a much better social life, and I really enjoyed the other parts other than academics. However, I was also in all the level 3 classes, which we referred to ourselves as the Ritz, because there's the Ritz-Carlton in Boston, very fancy place. And we referred to one another as the Ritz, retards in training. I mean, we could call ourselves that, but not anybody else. But we were always in rooms with no windows, or, someplace with a couple, 2, 3 teachers that were learning, and, it was a tough time. There were some good teachers that really worked to understand and to support me, and I really appreciate that, and I gravitated towards them. And one of the best things that I did was architecture, and I really gravitated towards the architecture teacher, because if I was going to skip class, it might as well be where somebody could find me. So there you have it. But all the while, my parents really did everything they could to understand my learning abilities and disabilities. They seemed to always be supportive and positive. I really reinforce that with families that I see now. Somehow believing that once the academic part of my life was over, that I would be fine. I always had somatic complaints, and my stomach hurt, and it was very difficult. You could read my autobiography on the Weaver Center website. And so I had a tough time getting into college, and even when my parents said, "Well, so what do you want to do about college?" I said, "All this time you've been telling me I'm a smart person? Who would sign up for another 4 years of this? 2 years?" So anyway, they really helped me, and my father and my mother, as they often did, they read to me, and they helped me study for things and so on and so forth, and helped me fill out the applications by asking me questions and so on and so forth. And I finally went to a small school, great school, but it wasn't in this country. And in those days, it was really expensive to be calling home. So after the first semester, I did have a couple of phone calls because I was just failing everything. In college, of course, they expect you to be reading and writing and taking tests and so on and so forth. You weren't like in classes where if you didn't throw something, you were, in pretty good shape. So my father talked with me because I was going to be home for the holiday times and didn't want to go back to school. So he talked with me about advocating for myself, letting the professors there know that I had a learning problem and so on and so forth, that I would like to, get through somehow, and could they help me? And gave me some information that was written for them to see. And so when I returned, I said I would give it another shot. When I returned, I was put in English as a second language student. I was the only one there that was still reading SRA and the different color readings and comprehension books. Anyway, so I know that my time's getting rather long here, so I'll try to make the rest of this relatively short. So by advocating for myself and going into tests and saying, listen, let me scratch some notes. I do know the material. I did a lot of auditory discussions with people and girlfriends and friends that would help me learn the material, so I knew the material, but I just couldn't write it down. So after still trying very hard, I finally got through with a lot of help from my friends. And I learned, one of my friends said, hey, of course you felt stupid. That was the intelligent conclusion. If you weren't smart, you probably wouldn't be figuring out how much effort you were putting in versus other people. And so I continued on to college and graduate school, and the more I was interested, the more I did better and better and better. And the story is something that I pass along to a lot of kids who are struggling in this domain, that there is a lot of hope, not just a little bit of hope, because there's a lot of strengths that come with having differences, including persistence, resilience, esteem, self-knowledge, and what we do now is develop the Self-Advocacy Manual, which is terrific for these kinds of things. And again, we do a lot of work, over Skype, and so forth. But again, if anybody has any questions or thoughts about this, please don't hesitate to write me an email, rweaver@weavercenter.org, or visit our website at www.weavercenter.org and check us out. Ask some questions. I'd be very happy to do my very best to answer them. All right. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it big time.